Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is U.S. Air Force Major Hasard Lee, who is both an F-16 and F-35 fighter pilot. In 2016, he was selected as the top instructor pilot of the year for the Air Force's largest F-16 combat wing. In 2017, he returned from Afghanistan, where his squadron dropped the most ordnance since the opening days of the war. He's flown 82 combat missions and has 4 air medals. He also has a popular YouTube channel and is the host of the Professionals Playbook podcast. And I'd like to mention that Hasard Lee's opinions today are his own and do not represent the Air Force or the Department of Defense. Hasard Lee, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
John, thanks for having me on.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today is all about the cognitive load that fighter pilots experience. And you've got a really interesting perspective, having flown extensively, both the F-16 and F-35. But before we get into that, could you give our audience just a little bit more background about yourself and the exciting career that you've had with the Air Force?
Sure, thanks for that. So I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico. I remember going to an air show when I was 5, saw the Thunderbirds fly. This was back early 90s when you could jump in the cockpit of an F-15. And so I remember hopping in there, putting on the helmet, looked like a bobblehead. And from that moment on, hooked on flying. You know, there's not a lot you can do as a kid. So I built the models, I played the video games, but didn't fly in an aircraft until I was in high school. Flew in a Cessna 152, knew I was hooked, but you know, it was pretty expensive. So I knew my ticket was the Air Force. And so applied to the Air Force Academy, didn't get in on the first try, went to a school called New Mexico Military Institute for a year, kept my grades up, then went to the academy. And from there, I was kind of on the path. I was fortunately pilot qualified, meaning I didn't have any health issues, which, you know, bit a lot of my classmates. Went to pilot training where we flew the T6 Texan II, amazing aircraft. It's kind of like a old P-51 Mustang, but modernized. So 1,100 horsepower, turboprop engine, and just loved it. That was about 6 months. And after that, flew the T-38 supersonic jet trainer, designed back in the 50s, little tiny wings, small engine. So they had to make those wings small. They had to optimize it for flying fast so it could go supersonic, really tough to land. But fortunately, out of that, got selected to fly the F-16, came here to Luke Air Force Base, learned how to fly the F-16. That was my dream aircraft. And then from there, went to Kunsan Air Base, where I learned how to be a wingman. From Kunsan, went to Shaw Air Force Base, became a flight lead, then an instructor pilot, deployed into combat, like you talked about in 2016. And spent 6 months out there, came back, got selected to fly the F-35, came to the F-35, transitioned, and I've been flying it ever since.
Yeah, awesome. When did you enter service?
Entered the academy in 2005, entered active duty in 2009.
Among your noteworthy accomplishments, you're the only pilot who has flown both the F-16 and the F-35 aircraft in combat on the same day. That sounds like a good story. Could you recap that for us?
Not quite. So I didn't fly the F-35 and F-16. So I flew 2 different types of F-16s. And yeah, that was a pretty crazy day. So it was my last sortie in Afghanistan before we were coming back home. So we had F-16 Block 50s. Those are optimized for the Wild Weasel mission. So that's what we flew out of Shaw. And so it was our last day flying. So our jets were getting ready to go back home. And so that is a lengthy process of taking off all the weapons, putting on travel pods. And we had a new squadron from Aviano, Italy that was ripping us out. And they had F-16 Block 40s. And so the last mission was supposed to be an easy mission where since I was pretty experienced, taking up one of their new pilots, showing them kind of the lay of the land, what we do, at a Bagram. And so we ended up taking off with two F-16 Block 40s. I actually got delayed because when you take a new jet into combat, it takes a little bit of time to get it optimized for that country. So you have to make sure to load the software correctly, even mechanically. It's a vastly different environment. So anyway, I had some trouble with my jet. There was a troops in contact situation, meaning there are ground troops under fire in Nangarhar. That's along the Pakistani border. And so I had him blast. So, he did a great job. First mission in combat, he's taken off by himself while I'm going to a different jet. And so I go to the spare. We always fly with a spare. And am able to start that up, still have issues on it, but am able to take off. And so I show up on station. He still has some avionics issues because the maintainers, they're awesome, but like I said, it takes a little time to spin up these jets. And so there's some avionics issues. He wasn't able to drop. And so it was a pretty bad firefight. And I was able to drop all my ordnance in about 10 minutes. And we were slated to cover a 4-hour vol. So we were the only fighter squadron in the whole country, because when we showed up, it was, Afghanistan was winding down. There wasn't a lot going on, but midway through our tour, Secretary of Defense Mattis took over, and he said he wanted all ISIS annihilated, since ISIS was starting to rear its head in Afghanistan. And so we changed from, not doing a lot to all of a sudden we were cleaning the rails every mission. And we were having a 2-ship airborne nonstop for 24 hours. And so we were supposed to cover this 4-hour vol. So that's about a 5 to 6 hour mission. I dropped all my bombs in 10 minutes. And so I get on the horn via SATCOM back to Bagram, and they say that they can have another jet ready for me, which surprised me because I was already flying the spare. Mm-hmm. So I don't ask questions. I plug into Max AB and start flying back home. While again, my wingman, he had a crazy sortie for being his first time in combat while he troubleshot his bombs, and he was able to fix them and able to support them while I was gone. But I fly home, and the maintainers, they had done an amazing job. So typically it takes a whole day to outfit these aircraft, but they were able to take one of the Block 50 F-16s that was slated to go home in a few days and turn it back into a combat line. So just want to give a shout out to all of them. So I land, hop in one of those F-16 Block 50s, go back to the TIC, the troops in contact, and end up cleaning the rails. So we were able to support them. There were no casualties. So pretty crazy last flight in combat.
Nice. And you mentioned this was, it sounds like this had to be early 2017, mid 2017 timeframe.
Spring. Yeah. Like April.
So the F-16 aircraft, aren't there a couple of different models, one with a single seat model and a co-pilot model as well? Which were you flying?
Well, we call those the family models, the D models. So no pilot wants to fly those because you sacrifice fuel, as well as it doesn't have as good of radios. But there are a whole bunch of different types of F-16. So the F-16 has been around since the 70s. And so they start with the A model. We're now flying the C model, but the two types that I've flown are Block 40s and Block 50s. And so Block 50s are a little bit newer. Even though they're the newest ones in the Air Force inventory, they were built in the late 90s, early 2000s. And for instance, when I was at Korea, we were flying F-16 Block 40s, and those were built in the 80s.
Right. Okay. So the single seat model then. Well, so can we start getting into comparing and contrasting the F-16 and the F-35? Maybe start with describing. You already started describing the lineage of the F-16, but go into a little bit more detail about what you're able to share about the instrumentation and the pilot experience and et cetera.
Yeah, so the F-16 has an interesting story. So built back in the 1970s, John Boyd was one of the key players on there, and he wanted a stripped down hot rod. So he was saying that these jets, there was scope creep and people would just keep throwing stuff on it. Stripped down hot rod, that was the original F-16. So just the gun, a couple of AIM-9 Papas, which are basic air-to-air heat-seeking missiles. And so it was a dogfighting machine. But as technology has progressed, we've started to outfit these F-16s with more and more and more sensors. And so, by the time I was flying in combat with the F-16 back in 2017, it was layered technology of, really the C model was built in the 90s. So 90s, 2000s, 2010 technology, all layered on top of each other. And it's not integrated. So each one of these sensors is tied to a different screen in there. And so it's very difficult to be able to process large amounts of information while you're flying. The best way I can describe it is if you are driving down a highway in your car, you have a laptop open in your lap, and you have 10 different browser windows open, and you're clicking through those, answering emails while you're driving. So F-16, very tough to do. Unfortunately, we've had 6 times the CFIT controlled flight into terrain of other aircraft in the F-16. A lot of it is due to G-lock because we're under a lot of G-force and the pilot passes out, but some of it is due to task prioritization and being overloaded and running into a mountain with a perfectly good airplane and unfortunately killing themselves. So the F-35 is a lot different in that it fuses all that information together into a red dot if it's a bad guy, green dot if it's a good guy. So it makes it a lot easier to process large amounts of information in the F-35. There's also a lot of other advantages to it. So like I said, F-16, its genesis is from the 70s. War has progressed quite a bit from that. So right now we're looking at the advantages of the F-35 being stealth. You can't just sprinkle some stealth salt on a plane and make it stealth. It has to be baked in from the ground up. Fantastic sensors. We have some really, really good sensors that can see out everything out there. And then that creates a lot of data. And so with that data, you have to be able to fuse it and pare it down for the pilot into stuff that's usable. There's true augmented reality in the F-35. So there's no heads-up display like in the F-16. F-16, our helmets had some basic augmented reality, but the F-35 is that on steroids. So when I look to my left and right, I can see my wingmen out there with circles that follow them with pertinent information about them. When I look ahead towards where the enemy is, I can see diamonds over them with all the information I need to know about them. So it makes my life a lot easier. And one of the questions I get all the time is it easier to fly? And it is if you are trying to do the same thing, but we are trying to maximize this asset. It's a very expensive aircraft. So we're trying to maximize what we do with it on the battlefield. And that means pushing the pilot. So we're looking to build pilots that are what we call functional seed team leads, where we're going out and leading 20 other aircraft for a mission set, as opposed to just a 2-ship or a 4-ship. So that's a little bit of comparing and contrasting the two aircraft.
Yeah, fantastic. That was a great recap. Could you start talking a little bit about the difference in cognitive load that you experience as a pilot when you're flying the F-16 versus the F-35? I'll let you take that in whatever direction you think is fruitful.
Yeah, I would say I am just as busy in the F-35 as the F-16. Like I said, we are able to process more information, which means that we can make higher level decisions. So I think this is what we've been doing since the beginning of time. So the F-16, when it first came out, its first electric jet, people were saying, oh, you're not a real man flying that thing. It has auto trim and all this other stuff. That's not a real jet. But what that allowed the pilots to do is spend more time focused on their radar, focused on dogfighting, everything else that they were doing back then. And now it allows us to focus on our targeting pod and a lot of other things. So I would say that we are equally busy. We just take a higher view of things. And those fourth gen fighters, as we call them, the F-15s, the F-16s, the F-18s, they're going to be with us till the late 2040s. So we're going to be with them for a long, long time, because it would be nice if everything was F-22, F-35. We're extremely lethal like that. Everybody's playing with the same level of aircraft, but that's just not the case. So we have to work together as a team, and threats have evolved massively, especially surface-to-air missiles in the last several decades. And so what that means is that with our situational awareness and our stealth, we can deny situational awareness to the enemy. So if it's a bad enemy, a lethal adversary, we can go in and kill it. Otherwise, we can direct the F-16s, the F-15s to take out that threat and save our missiles, save our fuel, so that we can stay on station for a longer time and give that situational awareness to the other fighters. And at the same time, we're stealth, so we can be on that leading edge.
Yeah. The interesting comment that you made about the way we advance technology, and you could probably describe it a number of different ways, but if you're looking at it from a cognitive dimension, advances in technology tend to improve or lessen the amount of brain power that has to be spent doing what are essentially rote gestures, or things that can be automated. We tend to automate them, and then that frees up your capacity to do higher level engagement or human sense making, which is still required in the F-35, but there's just a lot of stuff that has been automated that was not automated 10, 15, 30 years ago. Would you say that that's fair?
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of it is automated. So if you were looking at the F-35 from an F4, that was a third gen fighter built in the 60s, or a fourth gen fighter like an F-16, if you're looking at it through that lens, then you're like, everything's automated. What am I doing here? But that's allowed us to put on new bells and whistles and new tactics and things like that. So I think if we look at what the work week was going to look like in the 50s, everybody would say it's going to be a 5-hour work week because we can automate all the stuff we're doing now. But that just hasn't turned out to be the case. And it's the same thing with flying fighters, flying any aircraft. Back in the 70s, if you hopped on an airliner, there'd be an engineer there with them. But now all the aircraft have 2 pilots in them instead of 3, because you're able to automate that guy's job quite a bit. And it's the same thing with fighters. So we are just equally busy. We just have a lot more capabilities, a lot more things that we can do.
Right. So automation and technological improvements are glorious. I mean, we are living in, well, the best time ever, in my opinion. And a lot of that is thanks to our technological developments. But all of that comes, it's like, opposite sides of the same coin or double-edged sword. You pick your saying, but things that we mankind, people used to know how to do, have we've atrophied some of that, like everything from building a fire or in the military. I'm a retired Marine. Land navigation was something that was a big part of my officer training curriculum back in the early 1990s, and presumably Marines are still learning land navigation. But you get my point. There are things that people used to do and know how to do just like the back of their hand. And now those same capabilities, people would be hard pressed to be able to perform them. Reading a map, a paper map, or even remembering directions. I mean, I use my cell phone all the time now to help with directions, but I used to just know how to get from A to B, and I had it memorized, or I had people's phone numbers memorized. I don't have phone numbers memorized anymore. I don't even know my 15-year-old daughter's phone number, but it's on my phone. There it is. So I guess this is a long lead up, but have you and your colleagues ever discussed or grappled with so much capability and automation built into, for example, the F-35, but it would be equally applicable to the older aircraft as well, that some of the basic blocking and tackling of flying, those skills are potentially atrophying, or and so there could be catastrophic failure in the air, and a pilot from the 1960s might be able to handle it, but a pilot today would be on the horns of a dilemma. What are your thoughts about all that?
All the time. We're always debating, are we being too forward looking? Are we losing the fundamentals? Especially since I'm out here at Luke Air Force Base, which is a training base. So when I talked to before being at Shaw, that's what we call combat Air Force Base. That's where we can be deployed. Here, we're training brand new F-35 pilots. And in 2018, we opened up the F-35 to all pilots. So we're getting ones that are in their early 20s who are just showing up straight from pilot training. And so we debate that all the time. For instance, formation flying, stick and rudder skills, because a lot of what we do as fighter pilots now is we're systems operators. So we're trying to interpret large amounts of information and then be able to make decisions, communicate that effectively. Whereas back in John Boyd's era, it was a lot of dogfighting, stick and rudder skills that goes all the way back to World War II. Now I would say dogfighting is 10% of being a fighter pilot, so not very much. So that's been a big transition. And in the F-16, we had a really, really tough time making that transition because the F-16 is flown more like a F-35 now than it is flown like when it was first built back in the 70s with all the sensors and bells and whistles on it. I mean, when I was in Afghanistan, we couldn't even stay on the tanker. So we had so much stuff on the jet. So I would have to plug it into AB for a second, push the jet forward, and then go back to mill power, and I'd slowly slide off the boom just because we had so much stuff that we had put on the F-16. So it's flown a lot more like the F-35. That had a lot stronger culture and tied to dogfighting, BFM as we call it. But moving to the F-35, it's been great because it's a melting pot of new communities. So we have F-15 C and E model pilots. We have F-22 pilots, A-10 pilots across the board, you name it, it's here. We also have a lot of foreign partners. So we have Norwegians, Dutch, Danish, Italians, everybody here at Luke Air Force Base working together. So it's been a little bit easier to change the culture to what we want it to be. But definitely, I would say that pilots have less stick and rudder skills. Their formation flying isn't as good as it used to be. One thing we don't do anymore is like formation landings anymore, which used to be kind of a rite of passage back in pilot training. But that's really not applicable to what we do now. So we have those debates all the time, and I think we're on the right path.
You mentioned a tanker just a moment ago. Was that in-air refueling? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. How else does the Air Force work with all pilots, presumably, for various training that either enhances cognitive load or helps make its fighter pilot community the best it can possibly be?
Yeah, so that's a good question. When I was at the Air Force Academy, I boxed there, and the Air Force Academy is located in Colorado Springs, which is also where the Olympic Training Center is. And so I had a chance encounter with one of their sports psychologists that was walking through the halls one day, and he turned me on to sports psychology and this mental mindset of preparing yourself for peak performance, staying in the present moment, visualization, handling pressure, all these different things. And so I applied that to pilot training and ended up doing pretty well. I don't think I was great at any one aspect, but I did have this training, and I thought that this would be taught in pilot training, and it wasn't. And I used it throughout my career and did not see that anywhere in the Air Force. But a lot happened in 2018. In 2018, we got a grant to start treating pilots more like athletes because a lot of pilots were having neck and back issues from all the G forces up to 9 Gs. So when I'm doing those turns, I weigh over 2,000 pounds. So a lot of neck and back issues. And we were able to piggyback on that and put this mental performance training in. And so Luke started it, and now it's gone across the Air Force. So I was just out at Randolph Air Force Base, which is the home of the 19th Air Force. So they're in charge of all the pilot training bases. I think it's about 20,000 people. And so they are now implementing mental performance training as soon as pilots show up. So that can be software dependent. So there's different software where they're trying to get pilots to make decisions quickly, because as pilots, if you had to boil our job down to one thing, it's to make decisions. And a lot of them life and death decisions. We make thousands of decisions each flight. So that is the one thing that we're good at. And so this software helps to make decisions. There's also priming, coordination stuff, self-talk, visualization, something that we've been doing for a long time. We just call it chair flying. So we would close our eyes and mentally rehearse everything we're doing, but now we have some better techniques to bring into that. So we are full bore on cognitive performance training. That's happening now across the Air Force with pilots, and I'm excited to see where it goes when those pilots are 10 years into their career.
That is outstanding. When you were talking about chair flying, I mean, I start thinking about Zen and meditation and be the ball. But I mean, visualizing success and thinking through success, that's some powerful stuff. And yeah, I agree. Raising a whole cohort or cohorts going forward of fighter pilots and just military service members in general with those types of exercises could be a really powerful infusion of general mental health and well-being of the force. That's really cool stuff.
Yeah. I think mental health is really important. And to talk to your point before about changing the culture, this did take a lot of changing the culture. There were mistakes made, and so we had to kind of pivot and kind of move along as we did it. So it was not easy to change the culture, but the cognitive performance side has won out, and this is happening now across the Air Force bases. So I think it's really important to focus on mental health and to focus on peak performance. And I think back, the reason why some people didn't take to it is because it's a little bit wishy-washy. At least that's what people grew up with. But there is a lot of science behind this. Like every Olympic athlete does mental performance training. There's been a lot of studies, a lot of Air Force studies showing the effects on stress across the board. Stress decreases a person's performance. So you don't rise to the level of your expectation, you fall to the level of your preparation. And the Air Force has done these studies where it stresses out pilots. And what's interesting is different aspects start to fall out. So the one that is hurt the most is spatial understanding. So being able to hold multiple objects out there in your brain and build a 3D map of the world is the thing that falls off the most when you're stressed out. And unfortunately, as pilots, that's one of the things that we need to be able to do. So I think it's all based in science, and being an instructor pilot, having had a chance to fly with a lot of students over the years, I can say that this stuff really does help. And a lot, people that have had a background in sports and kind of understand some of these techniques, they are a lot more mentally resilient, and they are able to, no pilot flies a perfect sortie. You're going to make mistakes during a flight. They're able to isolate those mistakes and to move on from them instead of just dwelling on them.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts there. I didn't hear you say this, but there's a lot of studies happening with a human-machine interface, which very applicable to the F-35 or just operating equipment in general, and trying to make that as seamless and getting into a flow state as well. But also our service members, it's like spending a career or even just a single hitch in the military. It's like you're a professional athlete. A lot of people don't think about the military like that, but that's essentially what we need to have as far as a military, is a whole bunch of people who are at peak performance all the time. So it's gratifying to hear you talk about the way the military culture seems to be embracing that. When I was in the Marines, there was a fellow that came in talking along these lines, and he briefed our unit about, rather than go out and run 3 miles and beat your body up and your knees doing that 5 or 6 times a week, what would be better is if you instead wear your canteens and your, what we would call the H harness. You have your harness and belt, and you can clip canteens and ammo pouches, et cetera, onto the belt. It would be better if you just wore that around all the time, maybe with a little bit of extra weight, and that continual additional exertion would keep you in better shape without the likelihood of damaging your body as much. But I can remember, being a young lieutenant back then, it's like, yeah, no way, come on, no, it's better to go out and sweat and skin your knees up. I mean, that's what real Marines do. But there's probably a balance, right? There's the need for some of that, but also you can do some intelligent training that is likely going to optimize towards a higher quality end product, a service member who is at peak performance. And it sounds like that's the kind of thing you guys are doing, which is really cool.
Yeah, I think you can optimize for whatever you're doing. And yeah, you don't want to beat your body up. You want to have a long career, whatever you're doing. So, people sometimes say, hey, you're just sitting in a plane. How tough can that be? But under the G forces, like I said, we lost about one pilot a year from 2,000 pounds of force just squeezing you into the seat. And so the problem with that is the blood is being pulled into your extremities. So you have to squeeze your legs, squeeze your abs, and squeeze that blood back into your brain. And if you're not able to do that, you'll pass out. And at the speeds we fly, you'll impact the ground in about 15 seconds, and it takes about 30 seconds to regain control. So we do a lot with physical performance. We do a lot with sleep. So making sure that we have 12 hours, we legally have to have 12 hours of rest before we fly. Because again, the Air Force has done a lot of studies where they start cutting pilot sleep and then see how they do in the sim. And the thing is, after about a week, pilots can get used to sleeping less, but they're still making the same number of mistakes. So we have 12 hours of rest between flights, and then 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep between flights. So that rest part is really important. We do a lot with working out. We do a lot with nutrition. Just being 3% dehydrated can reduce your G tolerance time by 30%. So there's all these things that we're worrying about. And a lot of it corresponds to just having a better ability to process information. So how your brain behaves. So when I was flying, like I said, those sorties in Afghanistan, they were 6, sometimes 8-hour flights. And what I really realized is that your brain energy is like jet fuel. So in the F16, we carry 7,000 pounds of fuel internally. In max afterburner, we can burn 50,000 pounds an hour. So that's just like 5 minutes of fuel if you're in max afterburner. So we have to spend a lot of time learning to regulate our fuel. Sometimes you need max afterburner. Sometimes you need to pull it back. Same thing with your brain. You can't burn all your energy, especially on these combat missions, and then have a little bit extra to go home, especially with those mountains being, some of them are 24,000 feet, almost Everest height. So you'll be flying at 20,000 feet looking up at mountains. And unfortunately, the recovery phase of flying fighters is the most dangerous part, especially after a high, exciting mission. Your body's coming down, you're a little bit fatigued. It's easy to get complacent and then run into a mountain. So you need to save some energy to fly home, or if you get extended out there. So that was one of the things that I learned. And so for me, every 10 minutes or so, take a sip of water. And then maybe every 30 minutes, I had like a peanut butter pack, take a bite of that. So just little things to be able to prolong what you're doing.
Wow. Yeah. So many analogies with other areas of the military too, like Marines, when they're out and about, if you start feeling thirsty, it's too late. You're more likely to be some kind of a heat casualty, a heat stroke or something like that. So, drinking water continually, hydrating continually is the way to go. And it sounds like there's some similar analogies. And something else that I observed is, being in a C-17 and even in the back, I'm sleeping. I'm not flying the aircraft, but all of the little jiggles and jitters of flying, that's wearing on the body too. And so there's so much that goes into peak performance. It's really cool hearing you talk about it. I'd like to shift gears just a little bit. You've mentioned John Boyd a couple of times. Big fan of John Boyd and the OODA loop. What types of things do you and your colleagues talk about relative to the OODA loop in your fighter pilot career?
John Boyd is definitely somebody that I look up to. I have it on the bookshelf right behind me, his book. He changed the Air Force, but unfortunately, there's not really anything taught about him. He's held in high regard, and he changed how we look at building fighters, how we look at dog fighting, EM diagrams, energy maneuverability diagrams, all sorts of different things. So he's one of the few people in history to change a service. But in terms of actually learning about him and about some of the things that he's done, there's not a lot of that. But I can see his effect in different areas. So one of them is the debrief. So fighter pilot debrief is the most important part of what we do, or most important part of learning. So we'll go out and fly maybe an hour and a half for a training mission. We'll come back and we'll debrief that sortie 2 to 6 hours. So we'll spend all our time focusing on the few things that didn't go like we thought. And we might listen to the same radio call 10 times to figure out, was it the right radio call? Did we hear it correctly? Did we execute correctly? And so one of the models that we use is to assess, decide, and execute. So did you assess the world around you correctly? Did you build a 3D model? So we have what we call a cross check. So we're looking at all the different sensors and things in our cockpit, using our eyes, looking outside of the jet to just build an accurate 3D model of the world. After that, we have tactics decisions to make. And so based on the picture that we see, we have pre-made tactics for what we should do. Sometimes we'll build custom tactics if we have time and it's a special case. So did you assess the world correctly? Then did you make the right decision for what you saw? And then lastly, did you execute it correctly? Did you push the buttons in the correct sequence? And then also to go back to the human performance, did you perform to the level that you wanted to? Because sometimes there's 1,000 people that go into finding one target. They found the target, there's satellite operators, there's special forces, there's tanker crews that have to fly from other countries, and you're the last one to hit that pickle button. And so you can screw up the work of 1,000 people. So it's a privilege to be there, but you have to also be able to handle the pressure. So assess, decide, execute is kind of how we structure the debrief. And so I'm pretty sure a lot of that probably stems from John Boyd.
All right, that is fascinating stuff. You've been listening to Major Hasard Lee, Air Force F16 and F35 fighter pilot, talking about his perspective on cognitive load and how that is important to the fighter pilot community. Please go check out his YouTube channel and his podcast, and we'll have links to those in the show notes. And with that, Hasard Lee, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.